Hello, and welcome to the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. My name is Faden, and I'm the founder of Cape Coffee Beans, South Africa's leading retailer in the specialty coffee space. We sell everything you need to make an amazing cup of coffee at home, at the office, in the cafe, or even on the road, including equipment, accessories, and artisan roasted coffee beans, both online and in store at our headquarters in Claremont, Cape Town. This podcast is a deep dive into the world of South African specialty coffee with a focus on the brands, the businesses, and the people in the local coffee scene, many of whom I'm privileged to work with. I'll be bringing you interviews with many of these South African coffee heroes, so please do subscribe to the podcast and share it with your coffee-loving friends. Thank you for your support. Now let's get to today's episode. Before we get into today's interview, I just thought I'd provide a short introduction. My first guest is Joel Singer, who is the owner and one of the founders of Origin Coffee Roasting in Cape Town. Many see Origin Coffee Roasting as the epicenter of the specialty coffee scene in Cape Town. It has many accolades, including being one of the very first artisan specialty coffee roasters in the city. Some would say the first, though I'm sure that some would also dispute that. Regardless, Origin has played a pivotal role in helping specialty coffee become an important force in Cape Town, and their headquarters is still one of the places that every coffee lover that visits Cape Town must visit. Many of the best coffee professionals around the country have spent time at Origin because it has this amazing barista training academy and has been around for quite a long time. And so it really does feel appropriate that I'm starting this podcast with an interview with Joel, who's been with Origin since that very beginning and the whole way through. I should say that this is the first recorded interview, and in that regard, I think that it went quite well, though not without a couple of little hiccups. There is one little shortcut in the sound, and admittedly, upon listening, I realized that my microphone was probably set a little bit too loud. These are all problems that I promise I'll work out as we go through, but I definitely think that this is an interesting, fantastic start to the series of podcast interviews. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Joel, thank you very much for being the first guest on the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. I haven't told you this yet, but I'm particularly happy that you're the first guest because I'm very aware that you were there at the very beginning and the makings of the specialty coffee scene in Cape Town. So for those who don't know, you are the founder and owner of Origin Coffee Roasting. And I guess you could say you were there right at the beginning of the whole specialty coffee thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a bit of a wasteland in those days. I don't think we were the only ones by any stretch. We were at the coffee festival last year in Cape Town, and Pete from Seattle gave us a wonderful talk, and they were certainly here some years before us. And there were a few pieces of kind of players that people would still recognize today, Vita and so on, who were kind of at the beginnings of their life cycle in the time when Origin started in Cape Town.
Sure. Well, before we get into all the coffee history, maybe you could just start by telling the listeners just a little bit of your personal context and background.
Yeah, it's all a little bit strange and unusual how I ended up here. It was largely an accident, to be perfectly honest. But originally from Montreal, which is an unusual city in North America in the sense of, never mind the indigenous people, but kind of two major language groups. The French, who originally settled the region in terms of European settlers, and then the English who came later. So, I'm from a so-called multicultural country full of immigrants, but also with two main population groups and the original population and the complexities of all of that. So strange kind of echoes of South Africa. But Montreal is a city that kind of sits culturally kind of halfway between Europe and North America. So it's a French-speaking city in an English-speaking world in North America. And culturally, it's very much got a huge French influence and continental European influence on the way people are there. So I grew up a child of immigrants in a country full of immigrants in a city where you could hear 20 or 30 languages in a few blocks of one of the streets in the city, surrounded by the cultures of all of those people, the food of all of those people, the music of all of those people, what they drank, how they spoke, how they were socially together. And it was quite an unusual kind of environment. And then, strangely, I went to a University of Waterloo, which is on the west side of Toronto, about 100 kilometers away. And the city was also settled by immigrants, but immigrants from Germany, I think largely in the 30s, It was very much kind of a smaller town and kind of less dynamic and less vibrant in terms of cosmopolitanness than Montreal was. And I studied engineering there, and um, so I was studying engineering in a town that didn't have a lot of that kind of beautiful cultural fabric that Montreal had and the vibrancy that Montreal had. And in the middle of my degree, my electrical engineering degree at Waterloo, I ended up going to France for a year. And it kind of ties back into the coffee story, but I went to an exchange there, and I was at the university there, and they had a student cafe there, and we didn't really drink that much coffee except to try and stay awake at engineering school. A lot more beer going on than coffee. And we ended up I ended up in this wonderful cafe and seeing this absolutely beautiful French woman across the room, and kind of promptly fell in love with her, and I suppose fell in love with coffee at the same time and cafe culture at the same time. And when I came back from France after a year of living and traveling in Europe, I particularly missed that European end of culture, the kind of street culture, cafes, bakeries, restaurants, sidewalks, people being out, people being seen, and all of that. So I felt this kind of, I grew up with it to a degree, and then when I saw the full flourishing of what that culture was like, of street culture and just people and life, and as we all know from a great European city, when I went back to Waterloo, it was even more alarming to me that there was this kind of thing missing. So finished my degree. My intention was to go traveling, and then I had some good advice from my dad about going and maybe getting a job, because the job market in those days, as hard as it's to believe from this end, were not very good. In the world in general and in engineering. So I ended up applying for two jobs, one of which was at Microsoft in Seattle. And I went out there, and the two things I love most, the ocean and the mountains were there, and great food and an unusual city. And my God, they had great beer and they had great coffee. And, it was a little bit unexpected for a guy from Montreal looking at going to the States. And so I went and I worked for what was and still is one of the greatest tech companies in the world. And I had a wonderful time. The only problem is, through my years at Microsoft, I think I discovered that I love the idea of the tech world. I love the people that I worked with, but the industry and what I was doing for a living, which was project management and software design, was not really me. So having saved a bit of money, I decided I was going to go and travel around the world. And long story short, ended up in Cape Town. Through an accident because of some terrorists in Egypt that shot up a bus, and the guy I was going to go see just before I quit my job at Microsoft said, "Don't come to Egypt right now. It's a disaster. I'm not going to any pyramids with you. Come another time." And another ex-South African friend of mine said, "Well, hey, the invitation's still there. Why don't you come on holiday to Cape Town?" And so I did, and then met my partner, and now ex-partner, who's wife of my two kids. Still did quite a bit of traveling. I mean, I squeezed 40 countries in there somewhere. But we ended up doing a year in the States, Canada, and Mexico with my son when he was very small. And then through, unfortunately, the unfortunate passing of my dad, we ended up coming back to Cape Town. And my partner at the time decided to do a master's degree at UCT. So I ended up becoming a full-time dad for 3 years, which was an amazing experience, which I would never give up for anything. And then just after my daughter was born, and we'll talk about this in a sec, I ended up starting Origin. So, my son had a full-time dad for 3 years, and then Origin had a full-time dad for the next few years after that. Sadly, my daughter didn't get me in the same way that my son did. But having spent all this time in Cape Town, we finally decided to settle here after her master's degree was over, and kind of around that same time, Origin was born.
Sure. Yeah. So you've had a lot of international exposure, but chose to settle in Cape Town. So how many years have you been in Cape Town then?
I first came here on a holiday in December of '97, and then kind of was here for a little while, and then left for a year, and probably came back in April of 2001, if I remember correctly. And then probably properly decided to kind of settle here for the long term around the time Origin started in 2005.
Right, right. So definitely a long stint here. Well, I can certainly relate. Cape Town has also stuck for me. Going back to your journey with coffee, so you mentioned some of your first encounters with coffee when you were spending time in Europe. So did coffee continue as a passion from that time through to when you started Origin, or were there various
Well,
episodes in there?
Yeah, I think it was a big thread, because as I said, there was this kind of feeling around joie de vivre or something, which is, like people talk about Canada, and I don't want to say this in a way that would upset anyone from Toronto, but, Toronto was the kind of polar opposite of Montreal, and people joke that people in Toronto live to work and people in Montreal work to live. So there's a certain kind of way of being, which is about kind of enjoyment and the quality of life and all of that kind of thing. And I also lived in the States, and the West Coast of the U.S. was a bit more like that. The East Coast of the U.S. might have been more about the hard skills of life. And I think it was more broad than just coffee. It was about that feeling of culture and street culture and the love of just being out and being around people and watching the world go by. So I experienced that in Europe, and then I had an unexpected juxtaposition of that when I came to Seattle. Remember, I was in Seattle from 92 to 98, so it was the very early days of everything: Starbucks, artisan coffee, kind of craft beer. Like, it was the beginning of all of that. And I expected to go to a big American city and not find this kind of vibrant culture of locally made food and drink and people. And, because the US, in my experience as a young man growing up, had not really been that kind of place except for isolated spots like New York and San Francisco. But the US was going through what we probably went through 10, 15, 20 years later in terms of becoming a more open society and people celebrating life and celebrating the city and celebrating being together. And also that kind of what we call the new artisan culture, where flourishing of smaller local producers, people wanting to know who's producing their food, how their food is produced. And there was this kind of whole flourishing of people kind of connecting in a deeper way and kind of just doing amazing things. Things that at one time you might have had to import from Italy or France or whatever. People were innovating. They were doing wine. They were doing beer. They were making vinegar. They were selling spices from all over the world. They were doing amazing fusion cuisine of a sort that people had never tasted, because all of these things were new influences and new ways of combining them. So looking at it from this end, even in Cape Town, I mean, you look back and go, oh my God, like that stuff is not really that strange or unusual. But I promise you, if we all think back 20 years or 30 years, it was extremely strange and unusual. Um, and I think US culture, Canadian culture, but worldwide culture has kind of come a long way in terms of food and drink and kind of socializing. And many countries have developed quite rich cultures of their own. They don't have to necessarily look to a European example anymore, because they've created their own interpretation of those things, and the one that suits where they are and who they are, in an amazing way. And Cape Town is not the city that I originally saw. So there was that coffee incident in France, and then kind of enjoying coffee and, well, actually in France, let's call it enjoying cafe culture, because honestly, the coffee in France was appalling at the time. But the joy of coffee, and it is a social thing, and cafes particularly is a social thing. And then, as I said, I went back to Canada, the university. We didn't really have much of that in the town I was in. Then I moved to Seattle, and I was amazed to discover all these small roasters, small cafes. There's a famous story. The first apartment I stayed in when I moved out of my kind of corporate supplied housing for the first month I was at Microsoft, stayed in an area called Capitol Hill, which is now like a hub in Seattle. And just down the street, there was a little tiny place called Bauhaus. That was this cool place full of guys in black turtlenecks, all very serious about themselves, and a wall of books. And you could go there till 11, 12 o'clock at night, drink great coffee, hang out, pull a book off the shelf, read something, lots of cool people hanging out. It was like my neighborhood spot to go to. And then there was Railroad Espresso, and then there was Vivace, that a place that probably lots of people have heard of. And you look around this kind of whole place, and coffee was amazingly in Seattle, which is like an American town. Like, would you expect that? The cafe scene was like one of the cornerstones of social life and excitement about living in Seattle. And so, around kind of the 2000s, when I was in Cape Town and kind of with my son and doing lots of stuff, having lots of adventures together when he was a little guy, you kind of realize that for some reason, lots of stuff was right in Cape Town. We had great wine. We had some chefs doing amazing things. We had wonderful people, beautiful scenery, wonderful mountains, beaches, amazing, everything you could possibly want. But somehow, to me, there was this urban culture, this being in the city, this cafes, restaurants, and just kind of that street culture. But particularly cafe culture, I mean, there was bits and pieces of it, and Vito was a really early kind of version of this, and Seattle was their version of this. I guess Mug and Bean was their version of this at a time. But the cafe culture I experienced in Seattle, that kind of vibrancy wasn't really here. And so for a couple of reasons, but eventually I decided, one, I wanted to be part of new artisan culture in South Africa and helping to make that change that I saw in Seattle that I never expected. And you could feel it was coming, or the time was coming in Cape Town where hopefully that would be happening. We're 5 years before the World Cup at this point. And I just felt like, hey, I mean, I fell in love with coffee in Seattle and cafe culture in Seattle. And through a couple of coincidences I can tell you about, like I ended up going, well, if I'm going to stay in Cape Town, I don't want to go back into IT. Maybe that was a mistake, but I don't want to go back into IT. But what I would love to do is maybe kind of be part of creating or filling the gap in that new culture that I could feel was coming.
Right, right. And so this was 2005, is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Large.
tell us a little bit about the story of setting up Origin for the first time. You know, what was the intention? What was the plan? How did you get started?
Look, the coincidence was a little bit weird. I mean, I was in the middle of my partner's master's degree at UCT and looking after my son most of the time. We were talking about for the year that she was going to do her thesis. We went out for a weekend in Grayton, and like some people happens, we kind of fell in love with the place. And I thought, well, maybe we could live out there while she's working on her master's because I'm not working anyways. I'm living off some savings from Microsoft. Maybe I can kind of spend time in a country village with my son and enjoy walking in the mountain and somewhere quieter where he can ride his bike because, I mean, I was looking after him full time anyways, and she was busy studying. So we ended up buying a plot out there. And anyways, long story short, I ended up building the beginning of a large straw bale house. Never got a chance to finish it. And while I was out there, I met a couple of crazy people, a guy named David who ran the post house and another guy named Jake who had a wine farm. And we all got to be friendly and I was traveling back and forth between town and Grayton, as was my partner. And we all got to be quite friendly. And unfortunately, when my daughter was born, shortly after my partner's master's degree was finished, she was unfortunately not well. So we kind of got trapped in Cape Town. And we really didn't get a chance to kind of finish this idea that we had to build a house and kind of move out to Grayton for a few years. So we ended up back in town. I ended up selling the piece of property. And David, who ran the post house, and honestly, the post house was the place I probably had the first decent cup of coffee I'd had in South Africa. And then David and I started chatting, and he had the book from the guy that owned Vivace in Seattle. And so we ended up kind of interacting quite a lot and did a little bit of roasting together for fun and, talked about kind of ideas. But David came back into Cape Town and got busy with other businesses. And I was looking around. I was thinking I'd go overseas and study to be a baker, an artisan baker. So what Jason's did today, I was thinking of doing back then. Because my daughter was ill, we ended up having to cancel the trip. I was actually going to go to Italy and train. And I was chatting to some guys at a place called Mana that still exists in town about maybe taking over the space next door and building a bakery. And the lady there said, well, we don't really want to do bread with you. We're not interested in expanding what we're doing with bread, but we hear you roast coffee. Would you like to supply us with coffee? And just as she said that, my phone rang, and it was David coming down the hill. And so he said, where are you? I said, well, I'm chatting to these guys about bread, but they seem to want to talk about coffee. He said, okay, well, I'll come through. And he pulled in, and we had a chat to them. And next thing you know, we have our first wholesale coffee customer. And so we ended up spending a few months looking for premises and kind of planning things out. And we eventually kind of decided to go into the coffee game and roast properly and set up a roastery. So, it really was kind of a complete weird series of coincidences from a master's degree, Grayton, a straw bale house, David in a hotel, my daughter getting sick, us both being back in Cape Town, and some lady saying, well, I'd really like you to roast some coffee for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there it is.
Yeah. And that's how Origin started. And then, our first employee is also a great story. He still works with us, Willem. He's up in Joburg. Willem was our first employee who came and installed the alarm system. We didn't even have a floor. There were just like bits of underfelt stuck to this broken concrete floor in the space that we'd rented. And he installed the alarm, and we gave him a packet of coffee to say thank you. And he came back a few days later, and he said he emptied his pockets out. He had like 24 Rand 23. And he's like, well, I really thought that coffee was interesting, and it tasted like X, Y, and Z. And, I'd like to try something maybe with a bit more fruit. What can you give me for 23 Rand and 24 cents, So he said, "Oh, don't worry about it, man. Here's another bag of coffee." And he was supposed to go off to the UK and work on a like a youth visa. And he came back the third time and he said, "Well, if you guys can give me a job, I actually really like this. I don't think I want to go to the UK." And that was employee number one. The guy stuck our alarm system in. And he became our first roaster and our first barista trainer. Well, our first barista, then our first barista trainer, then the first roaster who roasted after me, and then the first South African barista champion. And we went to Kyoto together, and kind of the rest is history.
Right. And was this at Hudson Street where you got started, or were you somewhere else
Yeah.
first?
It was at Hudson Street, and I still have the same landlord who's kind of getting on in years, but still a cracker of a guy. And I wish we'd bought the building. I tried to buy it the first time, and when our lease came up, I tried to buy it the second time, and then I asked him to put a clause in his will that said I could have it when he's no longer with us. But he's turned me down every time. But like, there's so much blood, sweat, and tears soaked into the bricks in that building, like it's hard to imagine us anywhere else. So yes, we have
Sure.
been in the same space since the day we started, although the original roastery cafe all fit into what is currently about 2/3 of the footprint of the cafe that we've got today.
Right, right. Well, for anybody listening who hasn't visited the cafe, Origin on Hudson Street is definitely an institution in Cape Town. And once things like lockdown are done, I would definitely encourage anybody who hasn't been there to visit. It is a bit of a Cape Town coffee mecca in my eyes. So it's amazing to hear that you've been there the whole time. So was there always a cafe, or was it wholesale only to start?
No, we had a cafe at the beginning, but let me kind of be clear. When we originally started, the idea was, and we worked with a couple of very talented architects, John Jacobson and Cy from Metropolis Design, and we gave them a brief, and it was about kind of capturing the essence of when artisans were artisans and people still did things well and by hand and in small quantities, and where you could talk and connect with the person who was producing an amazing product. So kind of the I don't know, pre-heavily commercial, industrial, kind of modern agro-industry kind of universe. Um, and um, and so we designed the original store. The roaster originally sat basically just inside of the front door. So I would stand there and literally roast, and everyone who walked through the door, the first person they spoke to was me. And the green coffee was on a rack, and the open bags of green coffee were there next to the rack. And we used to pack the coffee on the left just as you came in, and then we had a bean sales counter, and we intentionally put the espresso machine in the back corner of the cafe, kind of where just behind where the brew bar is now, with the idea that we didn't want to be a cafe that happened to roast coffee. We wanted to be a roasting business that happened to have a facility where you could taste our coffee and the skill of the baristas that were pouring it, and
Right.
obviously indirectly see the quality of the training that we provided. So we were all about the roasting. We were all about helping people discover roasting. And again, looking back from this end, like, lots of people have seen a coffee roasting machine. Not everyone, but lots of people. And they know how coffee's roasted and they know what a barista is. But like, none of that was in people's minds in those days. They didn't realize that some of the best coffee producers were in Africa. They didn't realize there were different varieties of coffee. They didn't realize that coffee's mostly produced in, you know, tens of kind of developing countries around the world, and that in fact there is no coffee grown in Italy. I mean, we had to tell those stories over and over again, one person at a time, from the day we opened. And at one time, we were one of the few telling those stories. Now there's many more people telling those stories. But it was all about helping people discover, like, this thing that they were having. They were going to a Mug and Bean or a Starbucks, or they were buying coffee, but nobody actually knew what they were drinking. They didn't know where it came from. They didn't know what it took to produce it. They didn't realize some of it was cheap and some of it was expensive. They didn't realize some of it could taste like raspberries, where other bits of it could taste like hazelnuts, and some of it could taste like charcoal. I mean, they had no idea. So it was all about create this kind of universe where people can come. But we couldn't just build a factory. We needed people to taste the coffee, because you have to remember, in the day, and even today sometimes it happens, but less and less with all the years of hard work by us and everyone else. There weren't even really baristas. I mean, barista training was some guy installed your machine and then showed you there was an on and off button on the grinder and an on and off button on the machine, and that was about it. Nobody knew how to calibrate grinders. Nobody knew about basic dosing and tamping techniques. Nobody was worrying about extraction. Nobody was doing any of that. People were not steaming milk to the right temperature. They weren't doing it at the right texture. And it's not that they had a different idea of how to do it. They literally were unskilled. I mean, someone might go, I like my coffee hot. Okay, fine. This cafe serves their coffee hot. That's a choice. But they were just doing it with no information in hand whatsoever. So people didn't really largely know what they were doing. And people who were serving the worst grades of cheap coffee to the most expensive imports were typically serving coffee that was, I wouldn't have fed my dog if someone had given me a cup of it. But worse than that, like it was almost like no matter what coffee you were pouring, you weren't doing it justice and you weren't giving people the best that could be achieved from that cup because people just didn't know how to pour the coffee properly. So we kind of realized very early on. So number one, we made a decision, which is a bit unusual, and I think we can speak more about this later. But I was very clear in my mind that I didn't care about having a better barista pour the same quality of coffee everyone else was pouring. I didn't care about having coffee that was 10% better than what some of the best cafes were doing. Because remember, I'd come from Seattle, and Seattle was a place where some of the best roasters in the world were showing up, everyone in the world, including any roaster in Italy or anyone else. They were doing stuff, even in the time I was there in the 90s. The coffee there was off the scale exceptional. It's got nothing but better since then. So I wanted to measure myself against the people whose coffee I drank in Seattle. So I knew coffee could be far better than almost anything I could drink in South Africa at the time. Now, I wasn't just going to go by the same green as everyone else, try a little bit harder to roast, a little bit better and lighter than everyone else, train a barista a little bit better than everyone else, and claim to be the best roaster in South Africa, because I knew already that there was going to be something that was way better than that, and I'd tasted it before. And I can tell you a little bit about Vivace and how mad that guy was at the time. But like people were crazy about finding the best coffee in Seattle and Portland. I mean, even in those days, as crazy as it is to think about this now, you could not get a decent cup of coffee in California or New York City in the 90s. I mean, I spent a lot of time in San Fran. I went down to LA. I don't even think Intelligentsia existed. Ritual didn't exist. Blue Bottle barely existed. You could not find a decent cup of coffee. So if you were a Seattle person, you went to San Francisco, there was nothing worth drinking. Okay, and the average quality of what was being poured in San Francisco was better than what was being poured in Cape Town in those days. So I could have done as well as someone in San Francisco in circa 1995, and we could have probably gotten a lot of press and lots of fans and lots of attention. And I'm like, no, so I'm not going to swear, but I'm like, forget that. That's not what I'm interested in. What I want to do is roast coffee as good as the best cafes I ever went to in Seattle. And to a degree in Italy
Right.
as well, because I'd done some traveling in Italy. So I was setting the bar in a place that had no relationship to anything I was experiencing here. And
And
so in order to convince people, well, so that led to a few problems. The first one was there wasn't a lot of green coffee of that quality available in the country because for historical reasons that I'm not able to speculate on, I wasn't here. The market wasn't looking for coffees of that quality because they were more expensive. So as we all know, better quality ingredients, more expensive ingredients. So the level of care and attention that goes into producing great green, which is the basis for producing great roasted coffee and a great cup of coffee, it's going to cost more, and that coffee wasn't here. So I started importing my own coffee from some partners I have. So we imported our own green because we were looking for a level of quality. That meant I was paying more. Then we were roasting it with a high level of attention to detail, and I wasn't roasting it in a factory. I was roasting it by batches and by hand in small batches. That means our production costs are higher. Then we wanted to provide a level of training and long-term support, quality support to our customers who would pour our coffee that was far in excess of what anyone was providing at the time. Okay. In order to do that, we had to charge more. As soon as we were starting to charge prices that started to approach the imports and the better brands of imports, now we're going to try and convince people to pour this coffee. And back in 2005, like I would go to some of the best restaurateurs in South Africa and I would say, guys, everything you do, or almost everything I'm seeing is world class. Like you have the most beautiful venue, the decor is amazing, the food's amazing, the quality of the ingredients is good. You've got a pure South African wine list and the wines are sensational. Your staff are wonderful. The service is great. Why are you serving me a cup of dishwater at the end of the perfect meal? Like this is just not good enough and it's totally inconsistent with whatever else you're doing. And the next thing they wanted to know was the price, and the next thing they wanted was a free machine. So you very quickly realize that no matter what level of the market you were talking about, there were a few, but there were very few people who were willing to pay more for great coffee. Okay, they didn't believe customers cared. They didn't believe they cared. They didn't believe it was going to be a good decision for their business. They didn't believe it was an essential part of the customer experience that they were giving people, whatever else that might include. They just didn't really believe. So we had to build a cafe because we had to get better baristas than anyone else, to pour better coffee than anyone else, to get everyone from the food writers to the newspaper journalists to consumers to go, oh my God, I have never tasted anything like that before in my life. What have I been drinking all these years? So we didn't really particularly want a cafe, especially not a cafe that served food. What we wanted was a tool to get people to taste the coffee, not just see the roasting and buy packets of beans.
Right, right. Well,
Long question, long answer to a small question. Yeah.
no, but it's a great insight because I think it really kind of explains how Origin has gotten to where it is now and how the original idea translated into what I know and love as Origin today. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how has the business evolved since those original plans? What does it look like now?
Okay, well, the original notion again was a cafe, almost no food. Okay, so the first thing that happened, and I like separating coffee culture and cafe culture, or coffee the product from coffee the culture and the cafe culture. And so early on, I think we realized originally we did no food, then we bought a little bit of food in. A bit like you might imagine, a Seattle gets most of their food from other suppliers or a central kitchen or wherever they get it from, and they have a little bit of food on display, same as like a Vita in the old days. And we didn't really want food, but very quickly you realized, now wait a second, but we want as many people as possible to experience this amazing coffee. So we don't just need to create great coffee, we need to give them something good to eat with it. So then we started baking bagels, and then we started doing some baked goods, and then we built a small kitchen, and then we started doing eggs, and then we started doing more elaborate dishes and lunch. And but I mean, the focus obviously was on breakfast and baked goods because those are the things that are amazing with coffee. But we had to create a hub, and I think in a way it became a beast of its own, and I never wanted to be particularly in the restaurant business. I just wanted to get as many people as possible to realize that Origin's coffee was amazing, and that cafes could be amazing, and that baristas could be truly skilled and extraordinary and put it all together. And so we ended up building a large and successful cafe for no other reason than to get as many people as possible to drink our coffee and understand what it was we were about. So how has the business changed? So at the core of the vision is source the best coffee, roast the best coffee, train the best baristas, and put that coffee into the market at a price that can pay sustainable prices to farmers for producing that extraordinary coffee. Requires convincing people about the product, educating people about the product. So we created that aspect from the very beginning. And then it kind of got bigger because we felt we needed a certain amount of scale to a degree. And some days I question whether we needed to get physically bigger to any significant extent. I think small is beautiful in many ways, and many other roasters have shown that. But the idea was always in the early days, it's about sourcing, roasting, knowledge, education, baristas, and cup quality. And everything else is secondary to that, and building the market for that product. But for us to be the supplier of choice of people who wanted to serve exceptional coffee, whether it was in their home, in their office, in their restaurant, in their cafe, or anywhere else, their hotel, their guest house. So all of the elements were there. It was about the sourcing. It was about how we applied ourselves to roast as best we could. And it was about how we help people to pour the coffee to its full potential. And then also, as I said, creating that market where some people in the market were willing to pay more for great coffee, whether it was a consumer or a restaurateur or a hotel owner or a business owner. So, all those elements were there. What I did believe at that time was within a reasonable period of time, we would have a nice cafe that would be doing a small part of our turnover, and most of our business would be in selling to other people who would be pouring our coffee. So we would become a bean supplier and a training and quality support specialist, and we would build great relationships, but people would be drinking our coffee many other places, which they do today. But that cafe retains a very significant share of our business, much to my surprise. Not that I think it's not a great cafe, but I did believe that we would see more penetration of great, high-end, ethically sourced coffee into the market faster. And I think cafe culture has exploded. But I do think, coffee, I was trying to do great and exceptional from the early days until now. And I think there was a lot of poor coffee in the old days. I think now there's a lot of average coffee, but the trajectory of how much growth great coffee there is out there and how quickly that would come to be has been slower than I expected. And we're very
Mm.
much pitched at that into the market, both in terms of our pricing, our quality, and our approach. So, I did believe that we would have a lot more wholesale customers pouring a lot more of our coffee. And the challenge of building the market for high-end specialty coffee in the country has been more than I expected. It was very lonely in the early days. It became less lonely as more people got involved. But I think there's still an awful lot of average coffee being poured out there. So I think kind of the first 10 or 15 years that I've been in this game in South Africa has been about getting the average quality of coffee from poor to good, sometimes very good, occasionally exceptional. The job going forward is going to be to create a lot of places serving exceptional coffee and to have the consumers being way more demanding in what they expect in a cup, no matter where they are and no matter what level they're drinking at and what they're willing to pay. So we've come leaps and bounds. I mean, the world is not the world that it was, but I still think there's a long road to travel. So how has the business evolved? The core of the business hasn't changed. The mission of the business hasn't changed. I still believe in supplying independence and discerning people who want to serve great coffee. The mechanisms to achieve that, great relationships, being a strong and sustainable partner, continuing to source exceptional coffee from great producers, not compromising on the quality, not compromising on the ethics of the sourcing, and paying premium prices to farmers no matter what happens. And it is an uphill battle. And then trying to create this situation where we've kind of created the demand in the market and continue to grow demand in the market for what it is we do. None of that's changed, but I didn't expect the cafe, and I'm talking about the HQ cafe primarily in Devarakan, I didn't expect that to be as big and significant a chunk of our long-term business as it actually is. I also expected one other thing which hasn't yet happened, which I think is a future thing, and I think COVID's going to drive this, is I think the culture of drinking great coffee at home is still in its infancy in South Africa. I don't think a lot of great roasters or Cape Coffee Beans itself has anywhere near the amount of volume it should be pushing directly to people who are making coffee for themselves at home and at their offices. I mean, I think the cafe scenes happen. I think restaurant scenes happen. I think quality still has a long way to go. But I do think consumers should be buying more great coffee from their favorite roasters to drink at home. And I still get the perception with consumers, and this has been severely disrupted by COVID, I still think that people think great coffee is something they have with froth milk in a cappuccino cup in a cafe when they go out, and what they drink at home is something else. And they don't think about drinking truly exceptional coffee at home. And suddenly they find themselves in the middle of COVID without access to all those cafes that they love to go and drink their coffee at.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Well, you and I have obviously had this conversation in a few different forms, a few times, and I would definitely agree. But I do think I'm seeing signs that, as you say, the current situation is maybe changing perspectives on that a little bit, and more people are waking up to the reality that you can make fantastic coffee at home. And I should say that I know, because we have our customer base that we've developed over the last few years, which isn't enormous, but we have a very dedicated customer base who's extremely devoted to brewing fantastic coffee at home and is very happy to pay a premium for that coffee. But as we both know, that's still a very small segment in the market, and
Yeah, but I,
maybe
but I don't
maybe
think it's any different than the restaurant industry. So if you think like the restaurant and cafe industry is ahead, I think what one always has to remember is I might have been trying to do stuff at the level that I thought some guys did in Seattle, and yes, I believe that the reason we have had 5 barista champions from Origin is because we've done that job well. And we were all about like showing how well it can be done, how far can things be pushed, and we're not on that journey all by ourselves by any stretch. But but at every level of the market, people shift. And believe me, remember when I said I moved to Seattle, the people that I grew up with said, okay, there's 3 things that are going to happen. So why in God's name are you moving to the States? Like as a Canadian from Montreal. So you're going to move to the West Coast. Like what are they? And we thought that about Vancouver. So never mind Seattle. What do they have out there? They got like fish and trees. And in Seattle, you could probably throw in Boeing because they make a few airplanes. Like that's all we thought of what was going on out there. Yeah, nice nature, good place to go hiking. But like you're not going to find anything decent to eat. You'll probably get shot because they're violent and they all carry guns. You're not going to get a decent cup of coffee, and God, the beer tastes like piss. Like so, and that wasn't at all what I discovered. No offense. So but it was, we all knew the movies. It's like the bun carafe, the glass carafe, boiling away in the diner, the bottomless cup of brown water that tastes like nothing. That's what we thought American coffee was. Some parts of the States are probably still like that. But that's not what I found in Seattle. So what you saw, like as I saw these things, and you see them if you travel and you're lucky enough to have been around the world at various times, I'm sure you could travel anywhere now and see what you think is going to be happening in Cape Town in 10 years' time. So the point is, I think at every level of the market, the worker who's drinking coffee, who tastes his first cup of roasted and ground brewed properly, the guy who was drinking a supermarket grade of coffee that has their first bag of, something like specialty grade of coffee, or they used to buy coffee for 50 Rand a bag and they treated themselves to a 70 Rand bag of coffee, or they didn't know how to make a plunger properly and they didn't let the coffee steep for long enough and someone showed them how to do it better and their coffee got better. So it doesn't matter to me what level you're at in the market. It's about the awareness that like you could brew it better or you could brew it differently, or once in a while, even if you can't afford it every day, you can buy something better and taste it. Like as a young man, I didn't get to taste an awful lot of fancy stuff, but every once in a while, my parents gave me a nice wine to drink. And I remember going to my uncle's place in Hawaii, and he had a friend who ran the duty-free shops all over the Hawaiian Islands. And he had a cut crystal decanter, one of 500 bottles poured out of the only known remaining cask of French cognac that dated from before the phylloxera epidemic wiped out all the vines. It was 100 years old or something. It was like $500 for a tot of cognac. It was mind-boggling. I've never forgotten it. Have I ever bought anything close to that expensive? No. But I tasted it once and I know it exists. So I think at every level of the market, there's room for people to try something new, try something better, even if it's only once in a while, to know what is possible. I mean, you let someone taste coffee that tastes like cotton candy, but still tastes like coffee, and they're like, oh my God, what is this? Like they don't even recognize it as coffee.
Yeah,
So I think the education's there, and I think everyone who's doing anything in coffee is helping take people on a journey that allows them to discover something new, something better, something different. So it doesn't drinking great coffee at home, my grade and your grade might not be the same thing, but it doesn't mean because I'm at home I have to drink terrible coffee.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I see within the Cape Coffee Beans world that Origin tends to acquire a lot of devotees, people who once they start drinking Origin coffee keep coming back to Origin coffee. And I do think that a big part of that, is you guys have not just a really high quality of coffee, but also an unrivaled variety of really incredible coffee. And I know that that's one of the things that keeps a lot of people focused on the Origin brand. So could you tell us a little bit more about that approach to the sourcing and how that feeds into what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, look, I think one of the interesting things, and I'm kind of putting some cards on the table. I think when Origin started, we had 20 different coffees at any given time, and we were tiny, hey?
Mm.
I mean, I'm always someone who likes the world. When we launched tea with our division Nigiro, that's now run as a separate company, I had 120 teas. Most
Wow.
people were still like, can I have Rooibos or Ceylon? And that was about it. I had 120 teas. I mean, it was mad. But like I follow my own vision for things, not necessarily what the market's looking for right now, because I think the market's going to go somewhere else one day. So we had 20 coffees. Eventually, we realized that was a bit too complicated for people, so we cut it down to about 10. But I refused to cut it any further, and Nigiro's moved out, but we still have 20 of Nigiro's leaf teas in the cafe, even though I could probably only serve 6, and it wouldn't make any difference. So we stopped at 10. I wouldn't cut it any farther than that. But we started rotating them seasonally more and more. And in
Mm.
terms of sourcing, we've got an incredibly strong sourcing partnership with a company called Mercanta out of the UK. And I call them my sourcing division, and they're one of the greatest sourcing teams in the world. And they work with us and roasters in 40 different countries. And Stephen, who runs it's a pioneer in ethical sourcing of relationship coffees. They don't trade in anything except specialty grade coffees, and they have very strict ethical sourcing guidelines that are part of our philosophy as well. So a small company like ours, to have the depth of expertise to be able to run up and down every hillside in Ethiopia. Anyone who's tiny who tells you that, Maybe they went and bought 5 bags of coffee. But, there's a certain amount of selectivity, and one can buy across different channels, and some direct and some not direct, and all that wonderful stuff. But ultimately, there are layers in the coffee supply chain, and those layers exist and remain strong. Maybe you can talk to someone like Jonathan a little bit, who's got a much shorter supply chain than some of the other roasters, and kind of get some of his perspective on that. Very early in my coffee career, I did do some traveling to origin, which I later termed glorified coffee tourism, and troubled certain growers to spend some time with me when I was a tiny roaster, and they were very generous with their time, but then they wanted to know how many hundreds of kilos of their coffee I was going to buy. And then I realized, well, considering I only roasted a few hundred kilos of coffee at the time, I was hardly likely to buy most of his crop. So you very quickly realize that, roasters want to, growers want to sell containers of great coffee, good prices, not bags of great coffee. It is an agricultural commodity, and no farmer is selling 5 kilos of potatoes at a time if he's going to try and earn a living and put his kids through school. So we built this partnership with Mercanta, and what we did was we realized that Mercanta, as an aggregator of demand, is a huge buyer of coffee from many of these producers. So we traveled to visit the producers with them, with other roaster clients, to make sure that they weren't wasting their time talking to us, because together, collectively, we represented a large group of buyers. So I think of Mercanta and its clients as almost like a pool of roasters who follow the same philosophy in terms of ethics, who are focused on the same end in terms of quality, and who collectively are able to buy large quantities of coffee from growers and reward them with higher prices. And then obviously Mercanta, because it's an incredibly deep sourcing company with clients in over 40 countries, is able to source an extraordinary range of coffees, and we're able to influence some of that selection ahead of time, and kind of choose the coffees that we want to expose people to on the South African end. And so we've had a wonderful sourcing team that's almost like I've got a sourcing team I could never afford to have. I just get a portion of them. And collectively, the team in Cape Town is always assessing and evaluating coffees, to determine which coffees we'd like to present and to try and achieve range. Some roasters have a focus on African coffees. We've always had an incredible focus on celebrating Africa. I didn't move to Africa for nothing. And when Africa produces product in a category where we can produce product that is at the best, if not the best in the world, then I'm going to celebrate it. And in the early days, people told me, oh, people don't care about African coffee. They like Italian coffee, blah, 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 blah. I can promise you in 15 years, every single customer I've ever interacted with, local or foreign, who gets to taste an exceptional African coffee that they like, they will fall in love with African coffee. Everyone, local and foreign, is proud that Africa produces some of the best coffee in the world. So African coffees have always been a focus of ours, but I'm also someone who loves the diversity of the world from all my traveling. So I would not focus exclusively on African coffees, but they are a huge part of our portfolio, so we focus there. At one point, we even had Joanne, who was one of our barista trainers, who left South Africa because her boyfriend was living in the UK. She was South African, and she worked for me for a couple of years as a trainer. She ended up going and working for Mercanta as the head of sourcing in Africa for some years. So effectively a member of my team became Mercanta's African sourcing specialist. So, so we are able to kind of identify the coffees we think would be exciting. We rotate those coffees seasonally, because over the years we realized using the coffees within a reasonable time after they're harvested and ready to be sold is kind of ideal in terms of quality. And when you're paying a premium price for coffee, you want to use it at its peak. And then obviously we apply ourselves in a pretty rigorous experimental, based on experience fashion, to get the best out of each of those coffees. And between Willem, myself, and George and Mike, who was with us for many years as well, we're able with skill and a lot of experience to get really great results out of these coffees. We're very meticulous about roasting them consistently, but we roast almost 50 specialty single origins a year and do 4 seasonal espresso blends a year. And it's because, the world's a big place. Do you go to a wine shop and see 4 bottles of wine? Or do you go and say, ooh, you go into your favorite wine specialist shop and you show up and you go, well, I'd really like some wine. And they go, would you like red wine? Oh, yes. Would you like it to be made out of red table grapes or red wine grapes? Oh, red wine grapes, please. Well, I've got 1 bottle of Stellenbosch and 1 bottle of Bordeaux and 1 bottle of Franche. Which one would you like? So the world of coffee is like a spectrum. It's like a universe. It's a rainbow, So there's cheap coffees, there's expensive coffees, there's rare coffees, there's coffees that are common and accessible. There's coffees that are roasted darker to bring out certain characteristics. There's coffees that are roasted with different profiles to bring out different characteristics. There's different processing methods. There's different price points. Like you're not going to expect to get the same thing out of a 300 rand a bag of top quality Ethiopia or Kenya as you're expecting to get out of a 40 rand bag of Brazil. But why should you expect that? So it really is Origin's all about speciality. It's all about traceability. It's all about quality. It's all about roasting it as best we can. But it's also about celebrating the entire universe of even what lives in that segment of the coffee world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely say that I've profited from that variety and that selection over the years. And a lot of the memorable coffees that I've tasted over the years are ones that you guys have sourced and roasted. So I definitely encourage when anybody who hasn't tried those coffees to see. And it is one of the things that's bittersweet about it, right? Is that because you guys have this incredible seasonal variety, you can taste a coffee that's absolutely amazing, but of course it's only around for a couple months, right? And then it's about
Yeah.
finding the next one that you fall in love with.
Well, well, two things. The first one is that in the old days, people used to tell me, and some imported coffee reps used to be trained to say this sort of thing, is, ooh, Origin, they change blends all the time and their coffee changes with the seasons. And, your customers are not going to like change because your customers like the same thing. And no offense, like I've spent my entire life as a consumer and now as a producer believing that no customer wants the same over and over again, except maybe the consistency of their motor oil. Okay, people want consistently amazing, and they might want consistent value for their money at whatever price point that is, but no one wants consistently the same.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, of course. I mean, that is part
What
of
they
the
don't
intrigue.
want is to spend 160 rand on the next bag of coffee and for it to be really disappointing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, of
and
course.
Yeah, and that's where the specialist roasters come in and being able to come into the roasteries and speak to us or speak to us on the phone or call you guys the avatars in the sense of being in the online space with Cape Coffee Beans. And there are overseas guys who are fantastic at this. Your customers look to you like they look at a wine merchant. They come into your shop, you know what you're doing. You know wine shops like that in Cape Town. You walk in, you're saying, I'm having duck for dinner, and I'd really love to know what wine you suggest with it. Oh, no, I had that bottle last time. Don't you have a different Semillon? That one's a bit expensive. How about trying this one? Oh, that sounds fantastic. So that interaction of being able to recommend a coffee you might like based on either what you liked before, what you tell me you like. I mean, that is why it's different than shopping off a supermarket shelf, right? And it's a bit hit and miss. Shopping on label, you're shopping on price, maybe you're shopping on origin, but you're not shopping on someone's opinion that you value.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. And
Whereas
obviously
at
that.
Origin, you can have a sommelier speak to you. You can go speak to the roaster himself, or you can do some tasting while you're in the cafe and then go home with the coffee you like. And at CCB, you can read what you guys have to say and you can interact because the guys on your team know these coffees.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can go to a specialist shop online. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that is a big focus for us, but that actually leads nicely into the next thing that I wanted to ask you. I mean, you talked about your staff and how, they're trained and they know their coffees and they can speak to the customers. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your team. What is your team? What does your organization look like today?
Well, structurally, it's kind of ebbs and flows. There are a lot of people who've come and gone. There's a lot of people in the coffee industry who spent a bit of time at Origin who aren't at Origin anymore, sadly. Members of the family have moved on. Um, but the fundamental structures stay the same. There's the wholesale team and the retail team. The retail team being the guys that run the cafe, the wholesale team being the guys that run the kind of wholesale business. We consider our own cafe to be our biggest customer. And the kind of training capacity kind of sits within the wholesale side of the business. George, our head roaster, has been with me since 2007. Willem does some of our roasting as well on trips back and forth from Joburg as our Joburg roastery is being relocated. Willem was our first roaster. George roasted after him in Cape Town, but he's been roasting ever since. And I met George packing fruit and veg on the shelf of my neighborhood Spar when I got to Cape Town in 1998. And he was the first person I phoned to come and work at Origin the day we decided to open the business. And so George is our head roaster. He's also obviously heavily involved in helping to educate the staff and engage with customers. But I very quickly realized production roasting is a bit of a tedious job. So people like George and Neil, who I'll get to in a second, they split their time. So half of George's time is actually spent on the road with the wholesale customers who pour our coffee. So the person supporting you in the field as a restaurateur is the same guy that helped choose the coffees, optimize the roasting of the coffees, and who probably roasted the coffee for you that you're busy pouring in your restaurant, who happens to also be a very skilled trainer and barista himself. So you're dealing with the source of things as far back as you can go without going all the way to the farm. And then other senior member of the wholesale team is Neil, who's a kind of competition class barista in South Africa, placed very highly in nationals 3 years now. Neil heads up the Barista Academy, but he's also the lead barista. So he's also involved in kind of the operational things that creates kind of consistency and speed and so on in the cafe in terms of quality. But he's also involved in training all the members of the staff, including the waiters and so on, who are serving customers. So he's not physically in the cafe as much as he used to be because he's also on the road with a lot of our wholesale customers. But the team is accountable to him in terms of their development of coffee knowledge and coffee skill. Then we've got our back office team, including with Ramona, who's been with me, I think, 11 years now, who we call our wholesale, I think we call her the wholesale operations lead. I'm not one for titles and org charts, but and Ramona is the nerve center. The informal name we give her is the air traffic controller. She knows everything that's going on with every one of our customers, with our production, with our inventory, with our stock, with our shipments. She never forgets anything. She never loses track of anything. She knows everything. So she's kind of the nerve center where all the lines cross, and she's kind of origin central in terms of our wholesale business and also every employee and every person in the building. And ignoring Carmel.
And Ramona takes very good care of us. I also should say.
Yeah, look, for me, it's about people. You look at platforms like, should we get everyone to order their coffee online? I want people speaking to Ramona once or twice a week. I want us to know what's going on in their business with their partners. We're not a web portal. You know what I'm trying to say? So, yeah. And then we've got the accounts, which is Tanash and Rodney. And then we've got the kind of cafe team and the kitchen team. And, a lot of those people have been with us for many years. The one thing I can say at an evolution level is I'm getting a lot more hardcore with Neil and Annie, our cafe manager, that I want to see the team. There's almost a boundary that seemed to have existed because of the size of our cafe between the people who work on the floor and the people who work behind the bar. And I don't think great cafes are places where you interact with waiters. I think great cafes are places where you interact with coffee people. And so we are not just blurring the line between the waiters and the baristas, we're erasing the line. And that's obviously a process of recruiting and staff training and building skills and experience with people. But Origin has always been a specialty coffee business, and I want to make sure that every customer who comes through the door experiences us as a specialty coffee business, not a great place to get a cup of coffee. And of course, I mustn't forget my wonderful partner of 7 years, Joanne, who is kind of my personal partner as well as my collaborator in Origin. She and I got together 7 years ago. Obviously, she was peripherally involved because we were in a relationship. But about three and a half years ago, when she took a sabbatical from her normal career, very successful career as a senior executive, I asked her to give me a hand, and she promptly pitched in and gave us an enormous amount of her time during her sabbatical to help us kind of rethink the brand and distill the values of the brand and do a big piece of branding work for us, as well as to kind of restructure and build us a strong marketing team and marketing function. So, Origin has benefited tremendously from her contribution. And even though she's since moved on to other things, she's still an amazing pillar of support and deeply knowledgeable and engaged with the business and in supporting me and the rest of the team.
And how has the business and how has your team been affected by the COVID-19 situation and the lockdown?
Look, for lack of a better word, the only thing I can say is it's tragic. As one can imagine, the hospitality industry is a very challenging industry, and as a partner to all of my customers, and running my own cafe probably gives me the best insight of anyone into what their lives are like trying to run successful hospitality businesses. So effectively, the cafes are obviously closed because of lockdown. Almost all of our wholesale customers are 100% closed because of lockdown. They're all struggling on their own sides. And, there's a little bit of direct to consumer, this segment that I think is going to grow with time, starting from now. A little bit of work that we're doing with you and direct with customers as well, but it's a fraction of things. And so, one, we have a lot of our employees at home, and money is not flowing through the industry. I mean, I'm on hospitality leaders groups with lots of other restaurant owners, and I'm it's carnage out there. I mean, there's talk of as many as 30 to 50% of South African restaurants will never successfully get back on their feet. And that is a massive thing. So the team, I think, is at times worried about their future. I think the team is concerned about money, as they should be, and when they're going to be able to get back to work. Some of the team, I have to say, is missing Origin terribly, and the family that we are. And I think they're also missing our customers. And I think they're honestly, a couple of them have come back and said, "I've never been so bored in my life. I can't wait to get back to work." Um, but I think the thing that's really heart-wrenching for me is kind of the impact on people's lives and on their financial well-being and their personal well-being and that of their families. And we've tried to focus on doing everything we can to assist, and I continue to do that. But we all know that things are in a very difficult place, and I think that's putting people in a very difficult situation. And those of us who are maybe a little bit more fortunate are very concerned.
Yeah, of course. It is a very, very difficult situation, particularly
Yeah.
for hospitality businesses.
Yeah. So I'm trying to touch base with employees. I'm trying to touch base with customers. I'm trying to do everything I can to help them. But like I'm hearing the same stories from everyone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it is worth reiterating that one thing that customers or listeners can do to provide a little bit of support, it's not going to fix the situation, but a little bit of support can be provided by buying Origin coffee beans, which you can do online, and we certainly are encouraging everybody to do that. But we're also hoping even more that the situation will transpire so that you guys can get back to doing what you do best at Origin. And yeah, hopefully that'll happen, though I guess we're still waiting to find out when that will be.
Yeah.
So once that all does happen, what do you think the future holds for Origin? I mean, even, COVID-19 and the lockdown aside, what do you think, the future of Origin and the future of specialty coffee and where Origin fits into that picture in South Africa is going?
Look, I think there's a short term, a medium term, and a long term. I don't think the long term picture changes that much. I think the short term picture as a business and as an industry, I think there's going to be a lot of rationalizing. Some people are going to survive, some people are not going to survive. Some businesses are not going to be able to take back their entire full staff complements if they're not able to recover their turnover fast enough. And I think hospitality is going to be very hard hit. And looking at some of the government information, I think hospitality is going to be harder hit than some other industries because to a degree there's a high risk, and it's also to a degree people don't have to eat out. Takeaways might get going again soon, but like full scale sit down in cafes and restaurants in the next 3 months, I don't think we're going to see much of that. And even if the government allows us to do it, it's going to be very limited in terms of the opportunity. So, short term, again, I think there's short, medium, and long term. I think there's more opportunities in convincing people to pour better coffee at home. So that's the job you and we and everyone else is doing. And I think there's going to be kind of a shakeout in the industry. I think weaker players are not going to survive. And I think, for Origin's end of the industry, one can be concerned. One might say that because my consumer who drink kind of some of the best and more expensive coffee in the market are the affluent people who have that cushion. But I think in every way, everybody's affected in their own way. And I think consumers are going to be incredibly going well into kind of the 6 month and longer time horizon. People are going to be very careful with their money, no matter what level of the economy they're at.
Yeah.
So, how is that going to impact on us? Well, we're going to have to take the decisions we have to take, as difficult as they might be, to ensure the business is sustainable in the trading conditions that we find ourselves in. And, government has very hard decisions to make. I don't envy them at all. But the decisions that they make will inform what we are and aren't able to do. And then we will follow within those guidelines and achieve the levels of success we can for the benefit of our employees and our wholesale customers that we're able to do given the constraints that are imposed on us. But I think consumer restraint might be even more restrained than what the government's going to expect from us.
Yeah. Though as you and I have talked about before, there is that argument that we often think about, and hopefully some consumers are thinking about, is that if you used to spend $30 for a cup of coffee at a specialty cafe, you can spend $10 and make an absolutely sensational cup of coffee at home with the same beans that you would have gotten in that cafe. And right now, that's probably the option to be going for.
Yeah, as I say, I think there's a dichotomy in people's minds that like great coffee is a cappuccino made by a barista in a cafe where I get to sit and get served, and what I drink at home is like almost a different species. And there's no reason for that. At 200 Rand a bag of coffee, which seems awfully expensive, and you make a plunger with 20 grams of coffee, you're talking about 4 Rand a cup for an unbelievable, extraordinary cup of what is probably amongst the 2% of the world's best production of coffee, of one of the biggest commodities traded on the planet. So now you can have 4 Rand at home, or you can spend 30 Rand in a cafe. And if you want a cheap coffee, you could spend 2 Rand at home. Now you're telling me the person who was drinking a 30 Rand cappuccino doesn't still want a great cup of coffee and can't stretch. I'm not saying everyone, everyone's circumstances are different, can't stretch to turn that 30 Rand into a 4 Rand spend instead of a 2 Rand spend.
Yeah, the mind boggles at that kind of mathematics. So hopefully we can do a good job of convincing people that it's worth that extra 2 Rand. Yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
it doesn't have to be about expensive equipment, and it doesn't have to be about incredibly like rarefied skills. Yes, to produce the world's best AeroPress takes skill. There's AeroPress championships, world AeroPress championships. But to buy a decent coffee at whatever price point you can afford from the right roaster or right shop or wherever it is, grind it properly or get it ground properly, and then follow the basic guidelines for making an AeroPress, you're going to produce a great cup of coffee, and it's not going to cost you more than between 2 and 4 Rand a cup. In fact, by some calculations, instance more expensive than roasted and ground.
Yeah, yeah,
And you
absolutely.
don't need a fancy espresso machine at home. There's many great ways to make coffee, including without any equipment at all, that will produce a great cup of coffee. A cupping bowl is a brewing method, and a cupping bowl is a piece of porcelain, a spoon, and some boiling water and some coffee.
Yeah,
And it's
that's
one of
right.
my favorite ways to drink coffee. You don't need equipment. You don't even need
You
a
don't need
plunger.
equipment, no. We have a customer actually who you made me think of, who has purchased an espresso machine from us, but he doesn't use it. He makes his coffee cowboy style. So he literally just grinds and does it on the stove in a pot, and
Yeah,
he buys expensive coffee, and that's how he makes it, and he's really happy with it. In fact, he enjoys that more than he does his espresso machine.
yeah. Wouldn't the local version of that be more coffee, right? As the Afrikaners
I
used to call
suppose
it.
so.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
suppose
you
so.
can
Yeah.
shouldn't boil coffee grounds. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what are you drinking at home at the moment, Joel? What's how are you drinking your coffee during the lockdown?
It sounds really funny. When I went to fulfill you, well, I took some coffee home with me, but when I went to fulfill your order, the first order that Cape Coffee Beans did in the second week of the lockdown, I had to go through the roastery and check what we had in stock that was roasted that we could dispatch, and I found a whole lot of like half bags of things and leftovers when we packed stuff, and so I brought home all kinds of bits and pieces that I've been drinking. I've got a sample that I still haven't opened from a farmer in Madagascar that we met last year that we finally got around to roasting after we repaired a sample roaster. That's sitting there waiting to be tasted. I've never tasted it. I've got some of Neil's competition Benza Segera special fermentation coffee from Ethiopia. It's an exceptionally rare and exceptional coffee. This morning it was tasting like strawberries and raspberry juice and all kinds of crazy stuff. It's the last bag because you sold all the rest of them. Thanks, Faden. And I've got a bag of coffee, which was a Colombia Las Brisas that happened to be on the shelf that had a roast date of the 17th of January. Now, most specialty guys do not drink coffee that's 2 months old, but I had it. And I'm like, okay, I've had coffee that's 2 years old out of a bag from Origin that was still amazing. So I'm like, let me cut the bag open. It was one of the best plungers I've had in the last 4 weeks. So at home, I make plunger. It's my favorite, by far my favorite brewing method. And it's probably the closest to the true way in which kind of coffee pros in theory taste coffee when they're cupping coffees on the cupping table.
Yeah, absolutely. A good coffee will always taste good in a plunger. I feel like a plunger can reveal faults in a bad coffee, but if it's a good coffee, yeah, I often find the plunger is the way to go.
Yeah. I do miss having my baristas bring me a great
Cool.
cup of coffee in the morning, though, I have to say.
I'm sure. And well, hopefully you'll be able to get back to that soon. Hopefully you'll be able to get back there. Joel, it has been a really great discussion. Thank you so much for the time and for sharing your story and your perspectives on the South African coffee industry. As episode 1, I'm pretty sure that everybody's going to enjoy this a lot. So thank you very much. And as a reminder to everybody, you can support Origin by buying Origin coffee beans online. And hopefully people will be able to see you back at Origin HQ not too far in the future as well.
Let's all hope and pray that we're all in a better situation as soon as possible.
Cool. Well, thanks for your time, Joel.
Okay. Cheers, Fed. Thank you.
And there you have it, the first episode, or the first interview episode at least, of the Cape Coffee Beans podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed doing the interview with Joel and getting ready to launch. I do apologize for any audio issues on the first episode, and I do promise that I'm going to do my best to improve that as we go on. And I am excited to go on, and more episodes are lined up. So please, if you'd like to support this effort, subscribe on whatever your favorite podcast listening platform is. Even better, leave a review. A review on Apple Podcasts would be particularly helpful. Share it with your coffee loving friends. And one thing I would also like to ask you for is please give me some feedback. Share, comment on any one of the social posts that you see about the podcast. Drop us an email through the Cape Coffee Beans website. However you'd like to, give me some feedback on what you thought of the show and what you think I could do better. It certainly would be a big help. Thank you for your support. Until next time.